My fiancé said, "You'll regret it if you ever leave after disrespecting me once again." I said, "We'll see." Then I left in a way she couldn't possibly predict. When reality hit her, she begged for another chance. I, 32M, thought I knew everything about my fiancé until the night she showed me who she really was. We'd been together for 3 years, engaged for 8 months, and I believed we were building something solid. I was wrong. The evening started like any other. We were at her company's annual dinner, surrounded by her colleagues and their partners. I'd taken time off work, bought a new suit, and genuinely looked forward to supporting her big night. She'd been nominated for a leadership award, and I wanted to be there when she won. But from the moment we walked in, something felt off. She introduced me to people with this forced smile, like I was an obligation rather than her partner. When her boss approached our table, she stood up immediately and launched into animated conversation about quarterly projections and market strategies. I sat there, invisible, watching her transform into someone I barely recognized. Her colleague made a joke about how she probably kept me on a tight leash at home, and instead of defending our relationship, she laughed and said something about how some people just needed more guidance than others. The table erupted in laughter. I felt my face burn, but I stayed quiet, telling myself she was just trying to fit in with her work crowd. The real breaking point came during her acceptance speech. She thanked everyone, her mentors, her team, her parents, even her college professors. She talked about the sacrifices she'd made, the late nights, the dedication required to reach this level. I sat there waiting for some acknowledgement, some mention of the person who'd supported her through every one of those late nights, who'd picked up groceries when she was too exhausted, who'd listened to her practice this very speech a dozen times. Nothing. Not a word. After the ceremony, I approached her near the bar. I told her I felt hurt by being completely left out of her speech, especially when I'd been such a big part of her journey. Her response still echoes in my head. She looked at me with this mixture of annoyance and condescension, like I was a child interrupting adult conversation. She told me this was her moment, her achievement, and that not everything was about me. She said I was being needy and embarrassing, and that if I couldn't handle being supportive without expecting credit, maybe I wasn't as mature as she thought. I tried to explain that it wasn't about credit. It was about acknowledgement, about feeling like a partner rather than an accessory. She cut me off and said we'd discuss it at home, but her tone made it clear she thought I was being ridiculous. The drive home was silent except for her occasional sighs of frustration. Once we got to our apartment, I brought it up again, hoping we could have a real conversation about what had happened. That's when she said it. She told me I was being pathetic, that successful women like her didn't have time to coddle insecure men who needed constant validation. She said I should be grateful to be with someone of her caliber, and that plenty of men would kill for the opportunity. Then came the line that changed everything. She looked me dead in the eye and said if I ever left her, I'd regret it for the rest of my life because I'd never find anyone half as good as her. I stood there for a moment, processing what I'd just heard. 3 years of my life, and this was how she really saw me. As someone beneath her, someone lucky to be in her presence. I told her we'd see about that. She must have heard something in my voice because her expression shifted slightly. She asked what I meant by that, with just the faintest hint of uncertainty creeping in. I didn't answer. Instead, I went to our bedroom and packed a single bag with essentials. She followed me, asking what I was doing, her tone now more confused than angry. I told her I was giving her exactly what she wanted, the freedom to be with someone who truly appreciated her worth. She tried to backtrack then, saying she didn't mean it the way it sounded, that she was just stressed from work. But I'd heard enough. I told her I'd be back for the rest of my things later. As I reached the door, she called out that I was making the biggest mistake of my life, that I'd come crawling back within a week. I just kept walking. Update 1. The first few days were rough, I'll admit. I stayed at my brother's place, sleeping on his couch and questioning whether I'd overreacted. Her words kept playing in my head, not the cruel ones, but the ones about me never finding anyone better. Part of me wondered if she was right. But then I started thinking about the past few months with fresh eyes. How she'd gradually stopped asking about my day. How she'd begun making major decisions about our future without consulting me. How she'd started treating our relationship like a business arrangement where she was the CEO and I was middle management. I realized this wasn't just about one bad night. This was about a pattern I'd been too close to see. She texted constantly for the first week. Long messages explaining how work stress had gotten to her, how she didn't mean what she said, how we needed to talk. I didn't respond. Then came the calls, which I also ignored. After that, she started showing up at places she knew I'd be, my gym, my favorite coffee shop, even my office building. During one of these encounters, she cornered me outside my workplace. She looked different, tired, less polished than usual. She insisted we needed to talk, that I was being immature by ignoring her attempts to apologize. When I told her there was nothing to discuss, she got angry and said I was throwing away 3 years over one argument. That's when I realized she still didn't understand what she'd done wrong. To her, this was just a fight that had gotten out of hand, not a revelation of how she truly viewed our relationship. I told her I'd contact her when I was ready to discuss dividing our belongings, then walked away. She shouted after me that I was making a huge mistake, that I'd never find someone who loved me the way she did. Even then, she couldn't hear herself. Update 2. 3 weeks after I left, I ran into her best friend at a bookstore. She seemed genuinely surprised to see me and asked how I was holding up. When I said I was doing well, she looked confused and mentioned that my fiancé had been telling everyone I was a mess, barely functioning without her. That conversation was enlightening. I learned my fiancé had been painting a picture of me as someone who'd fallen apart after losing her, who was desperately trying to win her back, but she was being strong and holding firm boundaries. None of it was true, but it told me everything about how she needed to see the situation to protect her ego. Meanwhile, I was actually thriving. Living at my brother's place had reconnected me with family I'd been neglecting. I'd started going out with friends again, something I'd gradually stopped doing during our relationship without realizing it. I was sleeping better, eating better, and feeling more like myself than I had in months. I also started therapy, not because I was falling apart, but because I wanted to understand how I'd allowed myself to become so small in my own relationship. My therapist helped me recognize patterns I'd been blind to, how I'd been slowly surrendering pieces of myself to keep the peace, how I'd been accepting less and less respect while telling myself it was normal relationship compromise. After a month, I finally texted her about picking up my belongings. Her response was immediate and desperate. She said we should talk first, that she'd learned so much about herself, that she was ready to make real changes. She begged me not to just throw everything away. I agreed to meet, but only to discuss logistics. Nothing more. Update 3. We met at a neutral coffee shop on a Tuesday afternoon. She arrived early and had already claimed a corner table, looking nervous in a way I'd never seen before. She'd always been so composed, so in control of every situation. She started talking before I'd even sat down, rushing through an apology about how wrong she'd been, how she'd taken me for granted, how she'd been dealing with imposter syndrome at work and had taken it out on me. She said she'd been going to therapy too, that she understood now how she'd made me feel invisible. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, she waited for my response with this expectant look, like she'd just performed the magic words that would fix everything. I told her I appreciated the apology, but that it didn't change anything. She looked genuinely shocked, like she'd never considered that sorry might not be enough. She asked what she could do to make it right, what she needed to prove to win me back. The desperation in her voice was something I'd never heard before, and honestly, it made me sad rather than satisfied. I explained that this wasn't about punishment or making her prove anything. I told her that her speech that night had been a window into how she really saw me, and that I couldn't unsee it. More importantly, I'd realized that I'd been shrinking myself to fit into her vision of what our relationship should be, and I didn't want to do that anymore. She started crying then, saying she'd made one mistake and I was ending 3 years over it. But I corrected her. It wasn't one mistake. It was the culmination of a pattern where she'd gradually positioned herself as the prize in our relationship while I became grateful just to be chosen. She begged me to reconsider, saying she'd do anything to fix this. She promised to include me more, to show more appreciation, to make me feel valued. But I could hear it in her words. She still saw these things as favors she'd grant me rather than basic respect I deserved. I told her about the apartment I'd found, about how I'd be getting my own place instead of moving back in. The finality of it seemed to hit her all at once. She asked if I was seeing someone else, if that's what this was really about. I wasn't, and I told her so. But I also told her that I was looking forward to finding someone who saw me as an equal partner rather than a supporting character in their life story. When I stood to leave, she grabbed my hand and said she couldn't imagine her life without me, that she'd never meant to make me feel unimportant. I believed her, but I also knew that intent didn't erase impact. I gently removed her hand and told her I hoped she'd find what she was looking for, but that it wouldn't be with me. Final update. 6 months later, I'm writing this from my own apartment, and I can honestly say leaving was the best decision I ever made. Not because I wanted to hurt her, but because it forced me to remember who I was before I started dimming my light to make someone else shine brighter. I heard through mutual friends that she'd struggled for a while after our breakup, that she'd finally started to understand what she'd lost. Part of me felt bad about that, because despite everything, I'd loved her for 3 years. But I also knew that staying would have been worse for both of us. She reached out one more time, about 4 months after our coffee shop conversation. It was a long email talking about all the changes she'd made, all the insights she'd gained about herself. She said she knew now what a real partnership looked like and wanted a chance to show me. I read it twice, then deleted it without responding. Not out of cruelty, but because I'd finally learned something crucial. You can't rebuild a foundation that was faulty from the start. You have to start over completely. I'm dating someone new now, someone who introduces me with pride, who asks for my opinion on major decisions, who sees my successes as our successes and never makes me feel like I'm lucky to be included in her life. The difference is night and day. My ex-fiancée was right about one thing. I did regret leaving her. I regretted that it took me so long to do it. I regretted all the times I'd accepted being treated as less than I deserved. I regretted not trusting my own worth sooner. But I didn't regret the decision itself. Not for a single day. Sometimes the person who claims they're the best you'll ever have is just the person who's most afraid of losing control. Real love doesn't operate on fear or manipulation. It doesn't keep score or demand gratitude for basic respect. Real love sees you as an equal, celebrates your presence rather than tolerating it, and never makes you feel small for wanting to be valued. I learned that lesson the hard way, but I learned it. And that, more than any revenge I could have plotted, was the real victory. She'd said I'd regret leaving if I ever did. She was wrong about the direction of that regret, but she was absolutely right about one thing. I would remember that decision for the rest of my life. Just not the way she thought I would.